Hey, good evening and welcome back to Answers on Eschatology. We're in video number 9 of our study of the prophets and the parables. Hey, before we get started, I just want to thank all of you who have tuned into this series and have told me how much you enjoy it and how much of a blessing it's been to you to better understand the prophets in the parables. And I thank all of you who have given me comments and encouragement, and I'm just grateful that these studies and what I've seen in the parables can be a blessing to you as well, and just help us see the ministry of Jesus and the Gospels themselves as part of a bigger picture that is unfolding in the first century, last days generation. Now, we're going to get into Matthew chapter 21 and the parable of the vineyard next, but not tonight. We're actually going to spend 3, maybe 4 videos exploring the context of this parable. And we're basically going to go through most of Matthew chapter 21. And the reason for that is because Jesus, throughout this chapter, prior to the parable, which begins in Matthew 21:33, he performs 3 symbolic acts in the sight of his generation, which is basically setting the context and the paradigm for the parable of the vineyard. And this stuff is so important. It's so full of Old Testament imagery and symbology that we just need to take time and go through these things before we jump, head first into the parable itself. So I'm gonna tell you, which I'm sure you're already aware, but I'm gonna list the 3 symbolic acts Jesus performs prior to the parable, and we're gonna tie them back to the Old Testament sources that Jesus was drawing from. And in the next few videos, we're going to stop and we're going to investigate each of these symbolic acts and what Jesus is communicating to his first century audience in the context of the parable of the vineyard. So, the first symbolic act Jesus performs is his triumphal entry, and that's in Matthew 21, 1 through 11. And we're going to specifically look at Matthew 21, verse 5, which is a direct allusion to and he's drawing directly from Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. And not only that, but in that triumphal entry, Matthew 21, 9 is also drawn from Psalm 118:26. So we're going to look at both of these passages and their Old Testament sources and what Jesus was communicating by that symbolic action. Number 2, second symbolic action, begins in the very next verse, Matthew 21, 12 through 17, and this is Jesus's cleansing or overthrow of the temple, okay? And specifically, we're going to look at Matthew 21, verse 3, which Jesus drew directly from Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11. Actually, this is almost a direct quotation. Jesus is drawing from Jeremiah and that entire context, and he's pulling it in to his generation and telling those Jews of that day something very specific. So we're going to look at all that in another upcoming video. And the third symbolic act that is in the context of the parable of the vineyard is the cursing of the fig tree. And we see that in Matthew 21, 18 through 22. And again, to narrow that down specifically, we're going to look at Matthew 21, verse 19, which is a loose, I'll just say this, it's a loose allusion to Jeremiah 8:13. And the reason I make this connection is because Jeremiah 7 verse 11, which was Jesus' source in Matthew 21:13, is in the exact same context, obviously, as Jeremiah 8:13, where Jesus loosely alluded to, drew from in Matthew 21:19. In other words, Jeremiah 8:13 fits perfectly with the context and the story that Jesus is telling through these symbolic acts, okay? That's one of the reasons I believe that Jesus in Matthew 21:19 in the cursing of the fig tree was drawing from Jeremiah 8:13. So we're going to look at all of this in the next few videos. These 3 symbolic acts are absolutely, undeniably important to understanding the parable of the vineyard. They just add to our understanding. They give us a bigger picture of what Jesus was communicating through that parable, both concerning the salvation, the restoration of the remnant, and the judgment and the overthrow of the Old Covenant kingdom and its citizens. Now, I'm going to read you basically a conclusion of, again, these studies that we're going to do is taken from some articles that I've written on the parables, and I'm simply drawing out little snippets that I'm going to be teaching in these videos. But I'm going to read from a conclusion that I've already written here, just concerning these three symbolic acts. And then in the next several videos, like I've said, we're going to go in, we're going to vindicate this conclusion, and we're going to vindicate all these connections that I have put forth for you this evening. So here's the conclusion. These three symbolic acts, the triumphal entry, the cleansing or overthrow of the temple, and the cursing and the withering of the fig tree, identified, number one, the then current condition of the temple and the Jewish nations. Two, the implications of the imminent judgment that was coming upon them. The picture that Jesus had painted was this: the time for Israel's last days salvation had come, and Jesus would return to Zion as King of Israel in their generation to establish the throne of David in the time of their visitation. And that phrase, the time of their visitation, that is drawn directly from Jeremiah 7 through 8, which is some of these sources that I've listed. Let's go on. But, here's part of the conclusion, but the arrival of the king in his kingdom would mean the arrival of a new temple. Under the promised new covenant, the Father's house that the Jews had defiled would be transformed into a house of prayer for all nations. Jesus was in the process, in his day, of restoring the Lord's vineyard, the house of Israel. So we're going to vindicate that conclusion. We're going to make some powerful connections concerning these three symbolic acts of Jesus. We're going to see where he draws from, where we've already seen it, but we're going to see the significance of why he draws from and how he's applying that to his first century generation. And all of this is so important as a lead up and as a context for understanding the parable of the vineyard. So we'll get to all that beginning next time on Answers on Eschatology. Don't miss this. This is going to be some powerful, powerful stuff as we explore the significance of the prophets in the parables. We'll see you next time. Have a great rest of your weekend. God bless.